The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday. Roy Callahan read it at the kitchen table of the house he had lived in for 22 years. He read it twice. Then he folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and sat there while his German shepherd, Drift, put his chin on Roy's knee and looked up at him. Outside, the November sky was the color of old pewter. The oak tree in the yard had lost its last leaves overnight. Roy was 66 years old. He had survived Fallujah. He had survived the cancer that had come back twice. He had not survived the bills that came after the cancer. The bank had been patient for 14 months. Then it had not been patient anymore. Roy had one place left on earth that technically belonged to him, a rocky slope in the San Gabriel Mountains that his father had left him 17 years ago. Worthless, everyone had said. Roy had never gone back, but Drift was already at the front door, waiting. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? Roy had bought the house in Azusa in 2001, 2 years before his second deployment. It was a 3-bedroom on Lemon Street with a deep yard and a covered porch and a detached garage where he kept his tools organized on pegboard the way his father had taught him. He had bought it with his wife, Sandra, who had left in 2014, not bitterly, just exhausted, the way a person gets exhausted by a long, slow thing they cannot fix. She had said on the last night that she loved him, but that she could not watch him disappear one small piece at a time and not be allowed to help. He had not known what to say to that. He still didn't. His daughter, Melissa, lived in Sacramento and called on Sundays and meant it. His son, Todd, was in the Army himself now, stationed in Germany, and they texted more than they talked, which suited them both. Roy had lived alone on Lemon Street for 9 years, with a succession of things that needed fixing, and a garden that got bigger each year because digging in the ground was the activity that turned his mind down to something manageable. The cancer had first come in 2017. Bladder cancer, caught early, treated aggressively, declared clear in 2019. Roy had celebrated this by replanting the back garden entirely and buying Drift from a breeder in Riverside, a 9-week-old German shepherd with outsized paws and ears that did not yet match his head. The cancer had come back in 2021. Different sight. The treatment had been longer and harder, and the bills had come in waves, each one larger than the last. And the VA covered some of it, and his private insurance covered some of it, and the gap between covered and owed had grown into a number that Roy looked at sometimes late at night the way you look at a hole in the ground, trying to judge the depth. He had refinanced the house once. He had taken a hardship deferment from the mortgage company. He had negotiated with the medical billing departments of 3 different hospitals, long phone calls with careful people who were sorry but whose hands were tied. In the end, the math did not work. The bank had sent letters. Roy had answered them. The bank had sent more letters. Then it had sent the notice. Roy was not a man who panicked. He had been in places where panic was the thing that got you killed, and he had learned a long time ago to slow himself down when everything around him was speeding up. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after reading the notice. Drift lay on the floor beside his chair, pressed against his leg. The dog's breathing was steady and slow. Roy put his hand on Drift's back and felt that breathing. He thought about his options. He listed them in his head the way he used to list tactical options, methodically, without sentiment. The list was short. At the bottom of it, almost as an afterthought, was the mountain. Roy's father, Clem Callahan, had died in 2007 and left Roy a parcel of land in the San Gabriel Range, up past the Angeles National Forest boundary, 112 acres of steep rocky slope and scrub oak and granite outcroppings. The property assessor had valued it at $11,000. Roy's brother Dale had laughed when the will was read. "Dad left you a pile of rocks," Dale had said. Roy had driven up to see it once, a year after Clem died, on a clear February day. He had stood on the slope and looked at the rocks and the scrub and the ridge above, and he had felt his father there in a way he could not explain and could not talk about. He had not gone back. He had paid the property taxes every year, a small amount, a habit of faithfulness to something he didn't fully understand. He had never thought of it as useful. He had just kept it because it was his father's. He called James Sutherland, the lawyer who had handled Clem's estate, now retired but still reachable. He told Sutherland what had happened. Sutherland was quiet for a moment and then said, "Roy, that land your father left you, did you ever have it properly assessed?" "The county said 11,000, Roy said. "The county assesses for tax purposes," Sutherland said. "That's not the same thing." "What do you mean?" Sutherland paused again. "Before your father bought that parcel, there was talk," he said. "I don't know what came of it. I think you ought to go up there, Roy. I think you ought to go look at it properly." Roy had asked him what he meant by properly. Sutherland had said, "Take your time up there. Walk it. Look at it the way your father would have looked at it. He didn't buy things without a reason." That was all Sutherland would say. Roy sat with that for a day. Then he loaded the truck. He drove out of Azusa on a Thursday morning before the sun was fully up. The city lights were still on to the west, and the sky to the east was a deep, cold blue with the first line of orange just showing over the San Gabriel Ridge. Drift was in the passenger seat with his nose pushed into the gap at the top of the window, reading the air as the city gave way to the foothills. Roy drove Highway 39 north into the mountains. The road climbed fast through Chaparral and then into the lower pines, switchbacking up the canyon wall with the creek far below. Silver in the early light. The air coming through the window gap turned cold and clean and smelled of pine resin and wet granite. Roy had not been in the mountains in several years. He had forgotten how quickly they changed everything. The noise and the flatness and the press of the city fell away within 20 minutes, and there was just the road and the trees and the rock and the sky going pale above the ridgeline. The property was accessed from a fire road that branched off the main highway just past the Forest Service boundary marker. Roy had the coordinates on his phone and a hand-drawn map Clem had left in an envelope with the deed. The fire road was rough. Roy went slow, the truck rocking over water cuts and embedded rocks. Pines closed in on both sides, the lower limbs brushing the mirrors. Drift was up on all fours on the seat now, watching through the windshield. After 2 miles, the road ended at a chain-link gate, padlocked, with a no trespassing sign that was old enough that the lettering had faded to near illegibility. Roy had the key on his key ring. He had never used it. It took a moment to work in the rust, but it turned. Beyond the gate, a track led uphill through the pines, barely a track at all, 2 faint lines in the pine duff, where wheels had gone once a long time ago. Roy parked and got out. The morning was cold and absolutely still. No wind. The pines were motionless. The sky above them was a pale, clear blue, deepening to real blue at the zenith. A woodpecker was working somewhere back in the trees, the knocking coming at regular intervals, very loud in the stillness. Drift jumped out and put his nose to the ground immediately. He moved in a wide circle, reading, his tail up and moving. He was a big dog, 85 pounds, dark and tan, with a deep chest and a calm face that people who did not know him sometimes misread as seriousness. He was serious. He was also very warm. Roy had always thought Drift was the most fundamentally decent individual he had ever known, human or animal. He got his jacket and his water and his father's hand-drawn map. He stood at the edge of the track and looked up the slope. The land rose steeply to a granite ridge a few hundred feet above. Below the ridge, partway up the slope, he could see through the pines what looked like a structure. Something stone, partially collapsed, barely visible through the trees. He had not noticed it on his first visit 17 years ago. He had not gone that far up the slope. Drift was already moving uphill. The dog was not ranging or exploring. He was going somewhere specific, moving up the slope in a direct line, nose down, tail up, the way he moved when he was on a scent that mattered. "Drift," Roy said. The dog looked back at him once, amber eyes bright, and then continued uphill. Roy followed. The slope was steep enough that Roy was breathing hard within 10 minutes. His left knee, which had taken shrapnel in 2004 and been rebuilt twice, did not like steep ground. He went carefully, planting each foot, using the pine trunks for purchase where he needed them. The morning light came through the trees at a low angle and laid long shadows across the slope. The granite outcroppings were everywhere up here, pushing through the thin soil, gray and fractured and ancient. Drift stayed ahead of him, checking back every minute or so, waiting when Roy slowed. The stone structure appeared through the trees as he climbed. It was a wall, or what remained of one, a dry stacked stone wall, 6 or 7 feet high at its tallest point, built in a curve that suggested it had once been circular, or nearly so. A third of it had collapsed inward, the stones tumbled and scattered, with decades of pine duff and pine seedlings growing between them. The standing portion was impressive. Someone had built this to last. The stones were large and carefully fitted, no mortar, just skill and patience, and an understanding of how weight and friction work together. Roy stood before it and looked at it for a long time. He put his hand on the stone. It was cold and rough and solid. His father had owned this land for 30 years before he died. His father had been a quiet man who did things deliberately and did not explain himself unless asked directly. Roy looked at the wall and thought about his father and felt the same thing he had felt on his first visit 17 years ago. That sense of Clem Callahan present in the rocks and the trees and the cold mountain air. Drift was at the collapsed section of the wall. The dog was moving back and forth along the fallen stones, nose down, working a line that went from one end of the collapse to the other. Then he went still. He stood at a point about halfway along the collapse and put his nose to a gap between two large fallen stones and inhaled deeply, held it, and made a sound low in his chest that Roy knew. That sound meant something real was here. Roy climbed over the tumbled stones carefully and crouched beside the dog. He put his own face near the gap. Cold air came up from below. Not the ambient cold of the slope, moving cold, the kind that comes from depth. Roy looked at Drift. "What did you find?" he said. The dog pressed his nose back into the gap and sniffed again. His tail moved steadily. Roy started moving stones. They were heavy. He moved them one at a time, rolling them aside, working methodically, his knee complaining and his back starting to talk to him within 20 minutes. He did not stop. He found the rhythm of the work and stayed in it. The stones came away and revealed beneath them a wooden cover, heavy planking, old, the wood gone silver gray with age, set into a rectangular frame of pine timbers. It had been buried under the fallen wall. Not accidentally. The wall had been built around it, built to protect it. Roy sat back on his heels and looked at the cover. His hands were dirty and cold. Drift sat beside him, pressed against his arm, watching. "Dad," Roy said, not loud, just the word. He lifted the cover. Below the cover was a shaft, rough cut, stone-lined, going straight down. Iron rungs set into the stone at intervals, old but solid, the kind of work you see in wells and old mine access shafts. Roy shone his flashlight down. 8 feet, maybe 10, a floor, he could see it, packed earth, and on the floor the edge of something. Something regular, not natural. He tested the first iron rung with his full weight. It held. He went down slowly, facing the wall, one rung at a time, his bad knee making the descent a careful thing. Drift appeared at the top of the shaft and looked down at him with great concern. "Stay," Roy said. The dog's ears went forward. He stayed. Roy reached the bottom. He stood on the packed earth floor and swept the flashlight around. It was not a cellar, it was a mine, or the beginning of one. The shaft opened into a horizontal tunnel, low-ceilinged, stone-walled, roughly 4 feet wide and perhaps 30 feet long. It had been worked by hand. Roy could see the marks of hand tools on the stone walls, the patterns of chisels and picks. At the end of the tunnel, the wall was different, darker, crossed with veins of something that caught the flashlight and threw it back. Roy walked the tunnel slowly. He put his hand on the far wall. The veins were metallic. He knew what he was looking at. He had grown up in California. He knew the San Gabriels. He knew what gold-bearing quartz looked like. His father had grown up poor in these mountains. His father had spent his life working with his hands and saving what he could and never explaining himself. Just doing. Roy stood in that tunnel with his flashlight and the cold coming up from the rock and felt the full weight of who his father had been. Clem Callahan had found this. He did not know when. Years before he died. Years, maybe decades of quiet coming up here alone and working this shaft by himself and keeping it absolutely to himself, because that was how Clem Callahan did everything. He had not filed a formal claim. Roy was certain of that because he had seen the legal documents from the estate and there was no claim listed. He had kept it the way he kept everything important. Close, private, present in himself alone. Roy came back up the shaft slowly. His knee was screaming by the top rung. He pulled himself out and sat on the cold stone beside the shaft opening and looked at the mountains. The morning had advanced. The light was full now, the pine shadows shortened. Below him through the trees, he could see the glint of the fire road. Above him, the granite ridge caught the sun and held it. Drift pressed immediately against him. The dog pushed his head hard under Roy's arm and stayed there. Roy put his arm around him. His mind was moving carefully, in the way he had trained it to move in difficult situations. Not jumping, not rushing, just taking it one step at a time. He thought about what he had. He thought about what it meant. He thought about James Sutherland telling him to go look at the land the way his father looked at it. Sutherland had known, or suspected. He had known Clem Callahan for 40 years. He had probably suspected something and said what he could say without saying it directly, because until Roy went up there and found it himself, there was nothing to say. Roy sat on the mountain for a long time with his dog pressed against him and thought about his father. He thought about a man who had worked every day of his life and saved every dollar he could and spent his weekends on a rocky slope in the San Gabriels with a chisel and a pick and never said a word to anyone about what he was doing. He thought about why a man does that. He thought about it for a long time, and then he thought he understood. Clem had not been building a fortune. Clem had been building a floor, something solid underneath, for later, for when it was needed, for whoever came after him and needed it most. And he had known, the way quiet men who pay attention always know, that Roy was the one who would need it. A sound cut through his thoughts, a distant metallic crack, the sound of a rock giving way under pressure somewhere up the slope. It shouldn't have been anything. It was a mountain. Rocks moved. But something about the sound hit Roy in a specific place, not thought, reflex, and the slope was gone and the cold was wrong, and the air was hot and tight, and there was dust everywhere, and Martinez was down and Roy was calling into the radio, and nothing was coming back. His breathing shortened. His hands went flat on the cold stone beside him. The cold was wrong. It was supposed to be hot. He could hear the pines. There were no pines. Drift put his full weight across Roy's lap, both front paws on Roy's thighs, his head pressed up under Roy's chin, his body heavy and warm and absolutely present. Roy gripped the dog's fur with both hands. Cold stone under him, pine smell in the air. Drift's breathing against his chest, slow and steady, a metronome pulling him back to the right tempo. Roy breathed. Once. Again. The ridge came back. The pines came back. The cold was the right kind of cold. He was on the mountain. He was in November. He was alive. Okay, he said. His voice came out rough. He held the dog for another moment. Then he let go slowly. Drift stayed across his lap for another minute before he moved. The dog sat beside Roy and looked out at the mountains. His posture was calm. His ears moved slowly at the sounds of the forest. He was not watching Roy anymore because he had judged that Roy was back. He was watching the world again, doing his draw, keeping guard. Roy watched him. 9 years, Roy said quietly, and you still know exactly what to do. Drift's tail moved once against the stone. Roy drove back down to the city that afternoon and called Sutherland from the truck on the highway. He described what he had found without dramatizing it. Sutherland listened and asked 2 precise questions. Then he said, Roy, I need you to take photographs of everything in that tunnel, every wall, every inch of the quartz veins. And I need you not to speak to anyone else about this until we've talked to a mining attorney. A mining attorney, Roy said. There's a woman in Pasadena, Sutherland said. Her name is Diana Fong. She does mineral rights law. She's the best I know. Roy called Diana Fong's office the next morning. Her assistant put him through the same day, which told him Sutherland had already called. Fong was direct and specific and asked questions that made clear she knew exactly what she was dealing with. She asked about the shaft dimensions, the tool marks, the approximate depth and bearing of the tunnel. She asked if there was any surface expression of the vein on the slope above. Roy said he didn't know. She said he needed to find out, and she gave him specific things to look for. Roy drove back up on Saturday with drift and a better flashlight and a notebook. He spent 4 hours on the slope and in the tunnel, photographing and measuring and noting. He found the surface expression of the vein on the granite face above the wall, a thin line of quartz running diagonally across the rock face, discolored along its edges in the way that oxidation of iron sulfide discolors quartz adjacent to mineralized zones. He had not known that before Saturday. He knew it now because Fong had told him exactly what to look for. On the drive back down, he stopped at a pullout above the canyon and sat with the window down in the cold air. Drift was pressed against the door, nose in the gap, reading the mountain air going by. Roy called his daughter Melissa. He told her some of it, not all of it. Enough. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dad." "Grandpa Clem." Not a question, just his name. The way you say someone's name when you suddenly understand something about them that you hadn't understood before. "Yeah," Roy said. "How long do you think he knew?" she said. "Long time," Roy said. "He never said anything." "No," Roy said. "That was Dad." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I'm coming down next weekend. I want to go up there with you." "All right," Roy said. He heard her exhale. "Are you okay?" she said. "I'm getting there," he said. 3 weeks after Roy first went up the mountain, Diana Fong had filed an application to establish formal mineral rights on the parcel, a process that required historical documentation of prior use, physical evidence of mineral presence, and chain of title showing continuous private ownership. Roy had all three. The prior use was documented in the shaft itself and the tool marks in the construction, which Fong had a geological surveyor examine and date to between 40 and 60 years ago, consistent with Clem's ownership period. The mineral presence was documented in the photographs in the surveyor's own assessment of the quartz vein, which he characterized as a low to moderate grade gold-bearing formation that warranted professional evaluation. The chain of title was clean. Clem had owned it since 1977. Roy had owned it since 2007. No interruptions, no clouds. And mineral rights, once established on private land in California, are among the most legally protected property interests that exist. They are not subject to medical liens. They are not subject to foreclosure proceedings against the surface estate. A bank can foreclose on a house. A bank can foreclose on a piece of ground. A bank cannot touch what is under that ground if the mineral rights are separately established and held. Diana Fong explained this to Roy on a Tuesday evening in her office in Pasadena with the filing confirmation on the desk between them. "The foreclosure on the Lemon Street property can proceed," she said. "That's a separate matter and I can't stop it." "I know," Roy said, "but this parcel and the rights under it are yours outright and unencumbered and will remain so regardless of any other proceedings." She looked at him. "Your father bought that land for $11,000 in 1977, she said. "He paid the taxes on it for 30 years. She paused. "Preliminary assessment of the vein suggests a low-end conservative surface value in the range of several $100,000, possibly significantly more with depth." Roy looked at the window. The Pasadena evening was going orange outside. Drift was in the truck in the parking structure. Roy thought about Clem Callahan driving up into the San Gabriels in his old work truck on weekends for 30 years with a chisel and a pick and nobody knowing where he went or why. He thought about what kind of faith that was, not in money, not in luck, in time, in the future, in the idea that something solid built quietly over decades would eventually be what held somebody up when everything else gave way. Roy stood outside the bank's main branch in Azusa on a Wednesday morning. He had an appointment with the branch manager, a woman named Patricia Hollins, who had been professional throughout the foreclosure process and whom Roy had no particular grievance against. She had been doing her job. He went in and sat across from her and put Diana Fong's letter on the desk. He did not say much. He let the letter do the work. Hollins read it. She read it again. She looked at him. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I'll need to have our legal department review this." "That's fine," Roy said. "Take your time." She looked at the letter once more. "The property on Lemon Street," she said. "Is there anything—" "No," Roy said. He said it simply. No anger, no edge, just clear. The house is done. That's separate. I'm not here about the house. She looked at him. Then what are you here about? Roy looked back at her. I want the foreclosure proceeding documented as complete, he said. And I want confirmation in writing that the Callahan parcel in the San Gabriels carries no lien or claim from this institution, now or going forward. She held the letter. She looked at it. I'll have legal call you by end of week, she said. Thank you, Roy said. He stood up. He was even, steady, unhurried. He was a man who had walked out of worse rooms than this one. He walked out of the bank into the November sunlight. Drift was in the truck across the street. Roy could see the dog's head above the door, watching. Drift's ears came forward when Roy appeared on the sidewalk. His tail was moving. Roy crossed the street and opened the truck door. The dog pushed his head against Roy's chest. Roy stood there for a moment with both hands on the bunny's head. The sun was warm on his back. The San Gabriel Ridge was visible to the north, above the rooftops, pale and clear against the blue sky. His father's mountain, his mountain now. Still there, still solid, not going anywhere. Roy found the apartment in January. A ground floor unit in Monrovia, one bedroom, a small yard with a concrete pad, a fence along the back where he could see the mountains. It was not Lemon Street. He did not expect it to be Lemon Street. He was not the same person who had lived on Lemon Street. He was someone who had been taken down to almost nothing and had found out what he was made of, which turned out to be something he had not fully known before. He planted a container garden on the concrete pad, tomatoes in March, beans along the fence. Drift inspected each pot thoroughly as Roy planted and expressed opinions about the soil through his nose. Roy talked to him while he worked. The mining assessment came back in February, conducted by a firm in Sacramento that Fong had retained. The vein ran deeper than the initial shaft, much deeper. The geological profile suggested a formation consistent with the historic Mother Lode Belt, a branch of it that had not been previously documented in this part of the range. The firm's valuation was conservative, as these things always were in first assessments, but it was not the number of a worthless pile of rocks. It was a number that meant something. Roy called Dale when the report came in. He did not say much. He read Dale the bottom line of the valuation summary. Dale was quiet for a long time. Roy, he said, Dad knew? Dad knew, Roy said. Another silence. He never said a word, Dale said. No, Roy said. That was Dad. What Roy did with the valuation was not what some people expected. He did not rush to develop the site. He had conversations with Fong and with a conservation attorney she put him in touch with, and with a man named Torres from the Angeles National Forest Liaison Office, who came up to the parcel on a cold March morning and walked the slope with Roy and Drift and asked good questions and listened to the answers. There were ways to develop a mineral claim that preserved the surface land. There were arrangements that gave a veteran landowner income from mineral rights without turning a mountain into a wound. These things took time and required care. Roy was patient. He had learned patience from the hardest possible teachers. He went up to the mountain regularly through the winter and into the spring. He and Drift walked the slope in every kind of weather. In the rain, when the granite was dark and streaming and the scrub oak dripped and the creek below ran loud and brown. In the cold, clear days when the air was sharp enough to cut and the ridge above was dusted with snow and the sky was a blue so deep it hurt. In the early mornings when the fog lay in the canyon below and the mountain rose above it like something permanent, like something that had decided to be there and could not be moved. On one of those mornings, Roy climbed to the top of the ridge above the parcel for the first time. His knee made it difficult. He went slowly. Drift ranged ahead and came back to him at intervals, as if checking his progress, offering quiet encouragement. The top of the ridge was granite, broad and flat, with a view in every direction. To the south, the Los Angeles Basin, flat and hazy, spreading to the Pacific. To the north, the range continued, ridge after ridge, going blue and faint in the distance. Below him, his father's land, the pines, the stone wall, the shaft his father had cut by hand over decades. Roy stood on the ridge for a long time. His knee was talking to him and the wind was cold. and he did not care. He thought about Clem Callahan standing on this same ridge. He did not know if his father had ever stood here. He thought he probably had. He thought Clem had stood here and looked at it all and understood something and kept it to himself, the way he kept everything, and gone back down the slope and picked up his chisel and gone back to work. That was how you built a floor for someone. You didn't announce it. You just built it. Drift came and sat beside him at the top of the ridge. The dog pressed his shoulder against Roy's leg. His ears moved in the wind. He looked out at the view with the calm attention he brought to everything. Roy put his hand on the dog's head. "Your grandfather would have liked you," Roy said. Drift's tail moved slowly. The wind came up from the canyon and moved through Roy's jacket. The mountains went away in every direction, patient and old and still. Spring came to the San Gabriels the way it always did. Quietly at first, a softening of the light, then suddenly, all at once, the scrub oak putting out pale new leaves, the ceanothus blooming white along the lower slopes, the creek running full and clean with snowmelt from the high country. Roy drove up every weekend. Sometimes Melissa came with him. She was a steady person, his daughter, with her mother's practicality and something of Clem's quietness. And she walked the slope without needing to fill the silence, which Roy appreciated more than he could say. They ate lunch on the flat granite near the collapsed wall, sandwiches and coffee from a thermos, with Drift moving between them, hoping for contributions and receiving them. The legal work moved at legal speed, which was slow, but it moved. Fong had a junior associate now, handling the day-to-day of the mineral rights process, and she called Roy monthly with updates that were mostly incremental, but consistently forward. The bank had provided the written confirmation Roy had asked for. The parcel was clean. Roy had enrolled in a veteran housing stabilization program that the VFW in Monrovia had pointed him toward. The program had helped with the apartment deposit and with a small monthly supplement that took some of the pressure off while the mineral rights process worked its way through the necessary channels. A man at the VFW post named Curtis, who was 73 and had been in Korea and had the kind of face that had seen everything twice, introduced himself to Roy one Thursday evening, and they had talked for 2 hours about nothing important, and something had established itself between them that Roy recognized as friendship, which was something he had not made room for in a long time. Curtis came up to the mountain once in April, walking the slope slowly with a cane, and stood before the stone wall and ran his hand along it the way Roy had done on his first visit and said, "Somebody built this right." And Roy said, "My father." And Curtis nodded and said nothing else, and that was sufficient. One evening in May, Roy sat on the concrete pad in the yard of the Monrovia apartment with his coffee. The container garden was coming in. The tomatoes were knee-high. The beans had taken the fence and were climbing well. The mountains were visible above the rooftops to the north, catching the last of the day's light, turning the particular gold that granite turns in late afternoon, a color that has no name, but that anyone who has spent time in these mountains recognizes immediately. Drift lay on the concrete beside him. The dog was 10 now. His face was mostly gray. He moved more carefully than he used to on the mountain slopes, but he still went up. He still moved the way he had always moved out there, deliberate and attentive, reading the ground and the air and the trees, doing his job. Roy looked at the mountains and thought about his father. He thought about what it meant to do something for 30 years that no one knew you were doing, something hard and physical and slow, in service of a future you would not see, for a person who did not yet need it. He thought about what kind of love that was, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that just keeps showing up, winter after winter, with a chisel and a pick and the patience to go 1 inch deeper at a time. Roy had not saved his house on Lemon Street. He had lost it. He thought he had lost everything that mattered. He had been wrong about that, but it had taken going all the way down to find out. The things that mattered were still there. His daughter coming up the mountain, Curtis at the VFW on Thursday evenings, the container garden coming in, the mountains going gold in the late light, and Drift, who was pressing his head against Roy's knee right now with the same calm insistence he had been pressing it against Roy's knee for 9 years. in the good times and the hard ones, in the hospital and on the mountain and in the empty house and on the rocky slope above the canyon where an old man had left his son afloor. Roy put his hand on the dog's head. The mountains held their light for another few minutes. Then they gave it up slowly and the sky went deep blue above the ridge and the first stars appeared. Roy sat in the yard of his small apartment and watched them. He was not a man who had much. He had what he needed. That turned out to be the same thing. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who built things quietly for someone else, leave a comment. Even just a 0 or a 1 tells me you were here. And if you want to walk with us into the next story, hit subscribe. We'll be right here when you're ready.